History loves to romanticize the hunt. Tapestries show nobles in silks, mounted on fine horses, chasing deer through misty forests. Horns blow, hounds leap, arrows fly. It's a performance of elegance, of tradition, skill, and control. But hidden behind the artistry is something far more grotesque. Not all prey had hooves. In parts of feudal Europe, the poor weren't just starving, they were fair game. Royal hunting grounds spanned thousands of acres, guarded by laws so strict they bordered on sadism. These lands weren't just private, they were sacred. To trespass was to violate the very fabric of the social order. And for peasants scraping together roots and berries to survive, stepping onto that land, even by accident, could be a death sentence. The crime? Poaching. The punishment? Execution. But sometimes they didn't wait for trial. Nobles, emboldened by law and status, began treating intruders not as criminals, but as entertainment. Some pursued peasants on horseback, loosing arrows as if they were chasing wolves. Others gave servants a head start, then released hunting dogs behind them. Captured victims were maimed, branded, or used as examples, their bodies strung from trees as a warning, or their corpses left in the woods, indistinguishable from fallen game. This wasn't justice. It was ritualized cruelty, a performance of power. The line between sport and slaughter blurred when wealth became armor. A noble could claim a man looked suspicious or threatened his game and face no consequence. The poor had no voice, no rights, and no name in the eyes of the crown. Their suffering wasn't injustice. It was background noise in a story written by the mounted elite. And the most chilling part? This wasn't rare. Records across medieval England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire document cases of peasants accidentally shot while gathering firewood or mistaken for animals during hunts. Accidents were convenient. Dead peasants didn't talk, and the forest absorbed blood quickly. The forest was full of life. Deer, boar, rabbits, pheasants, enough to feed villages for months. But that food didn't belong to the hungry. It belonged to the landowner. And the landowners? They had parchment. They had seals. They had laws. By the late medieval period, game laws were among the strictest legal codes in Europe. Under statutes like England's Forest Law or France's Ordonnance de la Chasse, peasants were forbidden from hunting, trapping, or even collecting fallen wood from noble lands. These forests, which once belonged to no one, were suddenly fenced by decree. Not physically, but legally. And crossing those invisible lines was treason against property. Think about it. A starving family who snared a rabbit could be fined more than they'd earn in a year. Repeat offenders had their hands chopped off. Some were executed on the spot, not for violence, but for daring to eat. Hunting, once a means of survival, became an act of defiance. And nobles ensured that it stayed that way. Patrols scoured the woods, often more brutal than the law demanded. They weren't protecting animals. They were enforcing hunger. Because in the feudal world, starvation wasn't failure. It was strategy. A hungry peasant worked harder, complained less, had no time to organize or resist. Hunger was control. And by criminalizing self-sufficiency, lords guaranteed dependence. The message was clear. You may live here, but nothing here belongs to you. This wasn't about preserving wildlife. Nobles weren't conservationists. They simply didn't want to share. Game was theirs to kill, for fun, for ritual, or for status. When a lord speared a stag, it was honor. When a peasant caught a hare, it was felony. And the punishments weren't just legal, they were symbolic. Poachers were sometimes forced to wear the animal skins of what they hunted, a grotesque costume meant to mock their desperation. Others were paraded through towns with arrows still embedded in their limbs. One English case recorded a man hanged with a rabbit tied to his waist, as if the meat was heavier than his life. The forest didn't just hold prey, it held power. And to step into it without permission was to declare, however silently, "I exist outside your control." And for that, the price was blood. The hunt wasn't just tolerated, it was ritualized. And like all rituals of the elite, it came with music, wine, and an audience. Medieval courts turned the act of killing into theater. Hunting parties weren't quiet expeditions. They were events, complete with costumes, heralds, and symbolic pageantry. When nobles rode into the forest, they weren't just looking for game. They were reasserting control over life and death. And when that game happened to be human, the line didn't matter, because power doesn't need to explain itself. Accounts from noble chronicles describe elaborate feasts following successful hunts, some where the criminal killed had allegedly been caught poaching, yet no trial was held, just blood, then banquet. Even troubadours composed songs glorifying the capture of trespassers. Their stories rhymed suffering with justice and turned execution into entertainment. Artworks from the period, tapestries, manuscripts, woodcuts, occasionally feature ambiguous figures among the animals. Not wolves, not deer. Men, sometimes naked, sometimes bound, always beneath the hoof of a horse or the arrow of a noble. These weren't warnings. They were trophies, visual declarations of who ruled the land. But it wasn't only visual. Hunting songs and poems often mocked the foolish peasant who dared cross into noble territory. These verses circulated in courts, sometimes performed during meals, reinforcing the idea that violence against the poor was not only allowed, it was poetic. Some traditions were even more explicit. In certain regions, mock hunts were staged with real humans. Prisoners, vagrants, or accused poachers were given a head start in the woods. If caught, they faced beatings, mutilation, or death. If they escaped, they earned nothing but a longer sentence when found. These games weren't hidden. They were hosted, attended, toasted. And the crowd? They laughed. Because in a world where birth determined worth, the pain of the poor was punchline, not tragedy. Their deaths were rendered symbolic, their suffering ceremonial. The forest wasn't a place of danger. It was a courtroom without walls, and the verdict was always the same. It wasn't just about killing. It was about reminding everyone who could be killed without consequence. The forest wasn't the only trap. The world outside it was, too. For the poor, survival meant navigating a web of invisible lines. Lines they couldn't see. Laws they couldn't read. Rights they didn't have. One wrong step, one foot over a property boundary, one rabbit snared, one complaint whispered in the wrong ear, and they were no longer peasants. They were poachers, criminals, targets, and they knew it. Fear was woven into the rhythm of village life. Parents warned their children not to stray too far near the woods. Stories were passed down of men dragged from their homes at dawn, of women whose husbands never returned from gathering wood. These weren't legends, they were memories. Communities learned to police themselves. Neighbors reported neighbors, hoping to deflect suspicion. If someone disappeared, no one asked why. If a noble rode through with dogs and blood on his boots, doors stayed shut. Eyes looked down. The message was simple: don't make yourself visible. Even inside their huts, peasants whispered. They whispered about the gamekeeper who took a girl and claimed it was legal, about the boys chased for sport and buried without names, about the man who begged for mercy and became a feast day anecdote in the Lord's court. This wasn't law enforcement, it was terror management. The wealthy didn't need patrols in every village. They didn't need walls. They had reputation. The mere possibility of violence was enough to shape behavior, enforce silence, and dismantle resistance before it even formed. And when resistance did appear, a poacher who fought back, a peasant who dared speak, punishment was spectacular. Bodies displayed, entire families exiled, farms burned as reminders. Justice wasn't blind. It stared you down from horseback with a crossbow and a title. The forest was vast. The village was small. But the fear was everywhere. And that's what made it so effective. Today, when people imagine the medieval hunt, they picture pageantry, trumpets, antlers, velvet capes. It's painted as a noble pastime, a communion with nature, a mark of status, even a source of early conservationism. But what they don't see, what they're not supposed to see, is the body in the underbrush, the blood that wasn't animal, the crime that was called sport. Because history doesn't remember the hunted, it remembers the hunters. The men who owned the land also owned the ink. Chroniclers wrote of majestic hunts, of kings slaying 12 stags before breakfast, of forest laws protecting nature. The stories were sanitized, turned into legends, rituals, games. Even paintings from the era elevated the hunter to almost divine status. Bow drawn, chin high, justice in motion. But these same heroes also chased peasants through those same woods. That part was edited out. The laws survived in dusty archives. The victims? They didn't leave letters. They didn't have tombstones. They had silence. Later generations continued the erasure. The Enlightenment reframed hunting as tradition. The Victorian era wrapped it in nostalgia. Modern textbooks skipped over the punishments entirely. And today, some even romanticize feudal society, as if hierarchy was natural, as if the woods were fair, as if the poor simply worked the land and the lords protected it. No one tells children that forests were once places where men were hunted like animals, that a rabbit could cost you your life, that a deer could sentence your village to collective punishment. Instead, they learn about falconry, venison, and codes of honor. The story was rebranded from atrocity to aristocracy, from terror to tradition. But every myth leaves a shadow. And in some forests, old villagers still speak of paths that no one walks, of names never recorded, of bones never claimed. Because even if history forgets, the land doesn't. The horns stopped blowing. The nobles traded velvet for suits. The forests gave way to fences, cities, borders. But the hunt? It never truly ended. Because the idea behind it, that the poor are threats, that the hungry are criminals, that property matters more than people, still echoes in the structure of modern society. Today, no one is chased on horseback through the woods. Instead, they're chased by eviction notices, by surveillance, by armed police in low-income neighborhoods, by policies that punish need and reward control. We don't call it poaching anymore, we call it trespassing. Loitering, resisting arrest. We don't display dead bodies in town squares, we display mugshots, statistics, criminal records that follow people longer than any chain. The medieval game laws were explicit. If you're poor, stay where we can see you, and don't touch what isn't yours. Modern systems aren't much different. Try sleeping in a public park. Try stealing a sandwich. Try asking why you've been stopped again. And just like before, the enforcers are protected by law. And the hunted? Still voiceless? Still punished for survival? Still buried? That's this time under bureaucracy. History likes to pretend it moves forward, that we've evolved past barbarity. But peel back the language and you'll find the same structure. The powerful define the rules. The poor pay the price. In the medieval forest, the arrow came without warning. Today, it's a policy, a system, a shrug. But the message is still carved into the walls of every courtroom, every locked gate, every overlooked grave. You were not meant to survive this world, only to remind others to obey it.